Welcome to the webinar, China's Meat Revolution, Agribusiness Growth and Its Limits. Hi, my name is Ben Lilliston, the Vice President of Program at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. IATP works locally and globally for fair and sustainable food, farm, and trade policies. Last week, China announced that it would abandon its historic commitment to grain self-sufficiency. In a series of 4 reports IATP released yesterday, we documented how China's rapid transition to an industrial model of livestock production is driving this shift in policy. Simply put, China cannot produce enough animal feed itself, so it is going global. The series of papers looks in depth at China's feed, pork, poultry, and dairy sectors, the past and future trajectory of the industry, and global impacts of their focus on increasing production of cheap meat. You can find all 4 papers at IATP.org. Today we have 2 contributors to our China series. The first will be Mindi Schneider, Assistant Professor of Agrarian, Food, and Environmental Studies at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, Netherlands. Mindi has done extensive field work in northeast and southwest China on the changing political and economic significance of pork and the relationships between increased meat consumption, peasant dispossession, and environmental crises. Mindi has published and spoken about her work in China broadly, including a 2011 IATP report called Feeding China's Pigs, Implications for the Environment, China's Smallholder Farmers, and Food Security. And then the second presenter will be Shefali Sharma. She's the Director of Agricultural Commodities and Globalization at IATP. Shefali is leading IATP's initiative on the social and environmental impacts of an increasingly globalized and concentrated meat industry. Her work in the past year is focused on China's meat and feed industries. Over the last 18 years, Shefali's work is also focused on international trade, financial institutions, and their intersection with agriculture, food security, and social justice. Before we get started, I want to let you know it's very easy to ask questions throughout the webinar. We will be answering those questions at the end of the presentation, but you can pose them at any point. Just go to the text box of your control panel on the right side of your screen, type in your question, and as moderator, I'll sort the questions as we go along, and we'll get to as many as we can after the presentations as time allows. So let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to Mindi.
So I'm going to be talking today primarily about the report China's Pork Miracle, Agribusiness and Development in China's Pork Industry that was released yesterday along with the 3 other reports that Ben just mentioned. In this report and also in my research more broadly, one of the things I'm trying to do is to tease out what it is that's general about agricultural development in China and what is more particular. To put that another way, I want to understand how the process and the actors that are involved in China's meat revolution are common to industrial livestock development anywhere, and to what extent they're unique to China's political and economic context. So one of the first things that's particular is that the meat of importance in China, or the meat of focus, is pork, and that the trends in the country's pork production regime have been influencing world meat markets for decades. So this graph shows world meat production from 1961 to 2010. And you can see on the red line here that represents pork, that in 1979, pork overtook beef as the most produced meat in the world, and it continues this upward climb all the way to the present day. And the primary reason for this initial movement of pork and its ascent to the top were policies initiated in China in 1978 that are called reform and opening. And among other things, these reforms were the first big push to industrialize livestock and meat production through relaxing and removing import restrictions, through encouraging agribusiness firms to manage agricultural surpluses, and by replacing state planning with market logics. So 1978 is a key moment in this story. And here we see the tremendous growth of pork production throughout the reform era in China. Here at the end in 2008, building to 50 million tons, and those figures continue to be even higher today. To put this in context, here you see figures that compare China's pork sector to world totals. So in 2012, half of the world's pigs, more than half actually, 56% you see here, and half of the world's pork was produced and consumed in China. And pork imports were low at only 11%, though even that low figure becomes significant given the massive scale of this sector, and pork exports were even lower. The point here is that to date, China's pork production has been undertaken for domestic development and for domestic use. So it's important to ask the question of why pork? Why is it that pork is the star of this meat revolution? And part of the answer lies in the long history of pig raising in China, which reaches back several thousand years. So evidence suggests that pigs were first domesticated from wild boars in southern China some 10,000 years ago. And for the last 6,000 to 7,000 years, pigs were raised extensively throughout other parts of the country, ranging from the extreme northeast of present-day Heilongjiang province to the Tibetan Plateau and all places in between. Up until very recently, virtually every household in China had at least one pig, and most places had their own particular pig breed. In 1960, the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences undertook a project to survey the state of indigenous livestock. And at that time, in 1960, they identified 100 indigenous pig breeds with even more locally adapted varieties. This ubiquity of pigs as part of the household is expressed in the Chinese character jia, which you see here on the left. This is the character for home and family in Mandarin, well, in Chinese more generally. And the character was built by putting the roof radical over the pig radical, or more figuratively by putting a roof over a pig's head. And I include this here just to communicate that the cultural meanings and significance of pigs as part of the very constitution of the home and family run quite deep. It's part of understanding this pork miracle. It's also important to mention that for all of this long history of raising pigs, it was the pigs that were ubiquitous in China and not pork necessarily. So people ate pork only once or twice a year, usually at Spring Festival and perhaps at weddings or other special social events. There's a figure that before 1949, farmers, which represented the majority of China's population, got only 1% of their caloric intake from meat, and the rest came primarily from grains. So that is to say that pigs were more valuable alive than dead, and were primarily valued for their role in converting farm and kitchen scraps into nutrient-rich manure to fertilize crop fields. So this is a quote from Chairman Mao about the utility of pigs. And this is a photo that I took in Sichuan province where I visited farmers who continued the craft of manuring and composting crop fields. In the reform era, that is the time since 1978, the meanings associated with pigs and pork have started to change significantly, such that today eating meat in general and pork in particular has come to signify wealth and progress. And these are quotes from my research that demonstrate this shift and show that pork has moved from being a rare treat like I described to more of a symbol of development. It's important to note that there are generations in China who remember the days when meat was rationed by coupon exclusively to urban consumers, and this history and the cultural memories associated with it helps to give even more weight to this idea of meat and pork signifying progress, signifying wealth. From the standpoint of supply and demand, commodity meat, or this meat produced in the context of reform and opening and of industrialization, it's been quite successful. Since 1980, the average per capita meat consumption has quadrupled in China to 119 pounds per person per year. And I want to have a word of caution here that China's average meat consumption is well below the averages in places like the United States, where the industrial model of production was born. So I put these figures here to serve as a clear reminder that when we analyze and critique China's meat revolution, it needs to be at the same time a critique of industrial livestock agriculture more as a whole and of the uneven distribution of meat consumption across the globe. So this is another way to say that these aren't just China issues. On the bottom of this slide then I have the pork figures. Since 1990, pork consumption has doubled to an average of 87 pounds per person per year. And now, while the issues associated with rising meat consumption, that I'll talk about later, aren't just China issues, when we put consumption in relation to production and in relation to the mechanisms of development, the scale and the potential impacts of China's pork industry become more clear. So, having introduced some of the ways to answer the question of why pork is at the heart of China's meat revolution, the next question is, how did China achieve this tremendous growth? How did the situation change so dramatically in the space of a little more than 30 years, from a situation where pork was peripheral in diets to one where pork is becoming more and more central? And one of the driving factors has been feed imports. In the Feeding China's Pigs reports from 2011, I detailed some of the politics of soy sector liberalization, of soy imports, and also in the report, The Need for Feed, that also came out yesterday as part of this set of reports. There's more detail on feed imports. So I don't want to spend time here talking about feed imports, other than to say that China is far and away the leading importer of soy in the world, with virtually all of those soybean imports going to livestock, and the announcement of grain self-sufficiency maybe changing means that this is going to become even more of an issue to pay attention to. And also just to signal here that we can't understand meat industries without understanding feed. So another factor in the pork miracle is the scaling up of production from the backyard to the factory farm. This figure here shows that as recently as 1985, smallholder, or what are called backyard farmers, who raise less than 10 pigs a year, produced virtually all of the pork in China. But throughout the reform era, because of policies and investments that support two larger scale production forms, the share of production is beginning to shift. There's now a form called specialized household farms, that are farms that produce anywhere between 10 to 200 pigs per year, and there's also commercial farms which might produce 200 pigs, 500 pigs, 10,000 or more pigs per year. And the categories of how we define these different scales are slippery, but the trend to consolidation and to more consolidated production is clear. So these are some more recent figures and predictions about continuing industrialization, integration, and consolidation of the sector. In 2008, one analyst reports that the number of pig-raising rural households declined by half in the space of 1 year. In 2009, in the wake of subsidies for larger-scale pig housing in particular, 60% of production reportedly came from farms that raise more than 50 pigs annually. And by 2015, COFCO, the state-owned agribusiness conglomerate, plans to produce 10 to 15 million pigs annually in its industrial operations. And most of this production is meant for slaughter and processing in the company's slaughter and processing facilities. So this last figure in particular demonstrates that integration that is taking place in the sector more broadly, with production, processing, distribution, and retail increasingly coming under the control of single firms. And COFCO is a Chinese agribusiness sector giant, but by no means is it a lone giant. So in my work, I've been looking a lot at the role of Chinese domestic agribusiness firms in the reform era and in agricultural restructuring. And I've been focusing on a particular class of firms called Dragonhead Enterprises that are designated by the government as, quote, lead firms for agricultural industrialization. Dragonheads are meant to be agricultural processors, distributors, or intermediaries, and increasingly they're also firms engaged in production. Dragonheads are recognized and labeled by central, provincial, and local governments, and they're supported through direct subsidies, through favorable loans, through tax breaks, and through brand recognition. And as officially designated leaders, Dragonheads are intended to both develop markets for agricultural products, as well as integrate smallholder farmers through various forms of contract farming. And there's a lot to say about Dragonheads and vertical integration, but in the interest of time, I'll just point you to the report if you're interested in more detail on Dragonheads and vertical integration. And for now, we'll move on to Dragonheads in the pork sector. So Dragonheads are well represented in pork. 9 out of the top 10 pork processors are dragon heads. 8 out of the top 10 retail brands and slaughter operations are dragon heads. And 6 out of the top 10 pig breeding and production enterprises are dragon head firms. And these top 3 processors, all of which are dragon heads, are particularly noteworthy, and they suggest a high degree of concentration in the industry. So for the past several years, these 3 firms, Shuanghui, Jinhua, Nurun, have vied for the top slot as China's top processor, and they switch off between number 1, 2, and 3 pretty consistently. In my research, I calculated that in 2011, the combined profits of these 3 firms was 86% of the total profits of the top 10 pork processors. And again, this is just demonstrating the increasing consolidation. I also want to mention that this phenomenon of concentration isn't unique to pork. This is according to work of researchers at Nanjing Agricultural University. The profits of the top 50 meat enterprises in China account for 85% of total meat sector profits. So I would expect this number to become even more pronounced, with even fewer firms having an even higher share of profits as support for dragon heads and for domestic agribusiness continues. And here, just to give some sense of the scale and importance of dragon heads, these are figures from the Ministry of Agriculture in 2011. They show that there were over 100,000 national level dragon heads. So the national level designation is the highest. If provincial and local designation was included, this number would be quite a bit higher. They had 5.6 trillion Chinese yuan in sales and reportedly covered 70% of the production of pork and poultry in their country. And even if these numbers are exaggerated, which analysts warn that they probably are, they still tell us a lot about the central role for agribusiness in China's development model. Now, I would argue that the pork industry in China is domestic focused and largely domestic governed. But that doesn't mean that there aren't foreign firms involved in the pork sector. So I think Shefali discussed this in the last webinar and also in our previous reports. The big global grain traders, the ABCDs, they're operating in China. Pork genetics firms like PIC and Hendricks out of Canada are also there. And international livestock equipment dealers like Big Dutchman also operate in China's market. In terms of meat processing in particular, all of the world's top 10 firms operate in China in some fashion through wholly owned subsidiaries or through joint ventures. And their China operations are outlined in more detail in the report. We won't spend time with them here. And so the most visible and by now well-known example of China and foreign firm relations is the Shuanghui buyout of Smithfield Foods last year, including a recent name change to the WH Group. So there's much to discuss about this deal, but for me it also serves as another indicator that pork remains at the heart of China's meat revolution, even if, as I think Shefali will now comment on, pork's share of total meat consumption is now decreasing. After Shefali talks about the poultry and dairy sectors, I'll return to talk about some of the implications of this pork miracle and of these deals.
So thanks, Mindi. From pigs, we move on to poultry and dairy. There are a lot of similarities and differences in the way that poultry and dairy production have skyrocketed in China compared to pork. Let's look at how meat production in China has shifted over time in the last 20 years. As you can see, in 1990, pork was the main meat of choice, but particularly in the last decade, poultry production has really taken off, and other meat segments such as duck and beef are rapidly increasing. One reason for the poultry boom is that it is much cheaper than pork since 2003. Though the government tries to manage the pork price through a strategic pork reserve, it takes much longer for sows to produce pigs once producers have decided to liquidate their stock because of price declines. Another reason is the massive increase in quick service restaurants such as Kentucky Fried Chicken or McDonald's that have heavy poultry-based menus. Here you can see that China is the second largest poultry producer in the world, and by 2017 it is expected to surpass even the United States. And the similarity with the pork sector, and perhaps even more exaggerated, is the shift from raising poultry in backyard farms to highly concentrated operations. This slide shows that today, the largest number of poultry farms in China have anywhere from 2,000 to 100,000 chickens. In contrast, the US has a vast number of farms with over 500,000 chickens. But the trend in China towards larger scale is increasing. What's important here is the dramatic shift from 1998, when 60% of the producers had less than 2,000 chickens, to just 10 years later, when 70% of the farms were raising anywhere from 2,000 to 1 million chickens, in a period of just 10 years. And as Mindi has pointed out, this massive shift has happened with the rise of dragonhead enterprises and companies vertically integrating up and down the supply chain. So you will have feed companies moving into poultry and poultry companies moving into feed, etc. And a massive rise in contract farming, much more so I would say than even pork. And looking ahead, what we see is a trajectory of moving away from wet markets that are dispersed in various towns and cities to a dramatic shift towards organized retail. This is at least the government's intention as a way to address bird flu, but we will discuss this issue in greater detail in our next webinar on industrialization of the meat industry and food safety concerns. This slide shows the projected shift towards organized retail. But wet markets will still continue to distribute at least 45% of the poultry produced, and the share of quick service restaurants will continue to rise. The fact is that the Chinese like their meat freshly killed as opposed to chilled or frozen cuts, and they like to eat internal organs. Hence offal, chicken feet, etc. make up a significant part of the imports to China. However, unlike the pork sector, the role of transnationals should not be underestimated, even as Chinese poultry companies such as Wen's rise to the top in the world. Tyson's Cobb Van Tress, Germany's Eric Westjohann, and Netherlands' Hendricks Genetics control virtually the entire market for grandparents breeders and layer hen breeders. And the other biggies, such as Tyson's, Brazil's Marfrig, which now owns Keystone Foods, US-based OSI, Cargill, and others all have joint ventures with Chinese companies, or in the case of Tyson's, also their own operations. And investment banks such as Goldman Sachs invest in the value chain. So moving on to dairy, I think this quote from Premier Wen Jiabao is a very significant one and shows the importance that the government ascribes to modernization or westernization of the Chinese diet. It shows the shift that China has made from having a largely lactose-intolerant population to one where children are literally flooded with hundreds of processed dairy products. One study that measured calcium intake in the Chinese population over a 20-year period found that while dairy consumption increased significantly through the 80s and 90s, the calcium intake actually declined. One reason for this could be the decline in consumption of other calcium-rich foods and the ability of the Chinese to absorb calcium through dairy. So the question of nutrition really needs to be looked at more holistically. Once again, you can see the dramatic increase in milk output, particularly strong in the last decade. And I think the slide is rather telling because it only goes up to 2006. And that's because the dairy industry dramatically shifted following the melamine scandal in 2008. And you can see this shift in this slide as milk powder production drops in China and imports start to rise. The slide also reflects government efforts to bring back the domestic industry after the scandal. This slide is one indicator of why the scandal happened in the first place. You can see that by 2006, 60% of the market was cornered by just 10 companies. So the concentration and the consolidation that Mindi talks about in pork is also very much reflected in dairy. And the large majority of it controlled by just 4, Yili, Mengniu, Sanlu, and Bright. Yili, Mengniu, and Bright being dragon heads, and Sanlu, well, they're all dragon heads, but Sanlu was 40% owned by the New Zealand transnational Fonterra. These companies set the price for dairy and set up middlemen to source milk from literally millions of producers to cut costs in their supply chain. The traders were contracted by these companies. The producers bore the risk and the input costs, especially feed, which continued to rise. And we started to see more and more adulteration in the milk supply. In the few years before the scandal, dairy farmers' incomes were decreasing, with 40% of households not even breaking even, and earnings in 2007 lower than 2006. The scandal decimated these milk producers, just as the government redoubled its focus on scale. As I mentioned, we go into these issues around food safety in the next webinar. But I think what's interesting about this story is that prior to the scandal, over 80% of the milk was produced by small producers who own less than 5 cows. After the scandal, there was a 72% increase in farms with 500 to 1,000 cows and a 55% increase in farms with over 1,000 cows. The government created a policy to move cows from small farms into cow hotels, where the farmer and the cows would literally be checked in so that there could be standardized feed, vaccines, and milking. Experts estimate that at least 15% of China's entire dairy herd was slaughtered for meat after the scandal. And we saw dramatic shifts in the dairy market, particularly the whole milk powder and infant formula market. Chinese consumption for whole and skim milk powder nearly doubled from 2008 to 2013, and 4 foreign brands have control of over 40% of the infant formula market. In July last year, the government launched an antitrust probe accusing 9 firms for price fixing in the infant formula market. 6 companies, including Mead Johnson, Fonterra, Dannon, Abbott, and Netherlands Friesland Campina, were fined millions of dollars. Nestle and Meiji were let off the hook, but Nestle also slashed its prices after the probe. It goes to show the growing power of the transnationals in the country, particularly with the dairy sector, but also the government's ability to crack down on them. In other developments, you can see a massive increase in imports of live dairy cows, and this is because investment banks and dairy companies are investing in cows that produce more milk than Chinese hybrids. But with more cows comes more need for feed, and we've seen a dramatic rise in alfalfa exports to China, particularly from the US. And it's interesting given the drought in California this year because alfalfa requires a lot of water, and our research uncovered that the 2012 shipment of alfalfa from California was enough to provide drinking water for over 50,000 families in the state. And there's much more to say. We have Chinese companies trying to invest in ranches in Australia and New Zealand, and companies like Fonterra and others building ranches in China, and you can find details about all of these transitions in our dairy report. But all of these changes drive us to ask a fundamental question. Have the costs begun to outweigh the benefits of this meat and dairy revolution? And has China reached the peak of this boom? I will start us off with one example that is a serious problem here in the US, and that's antibiotic resistance and the rise of superbugs due to the abuse and overuse of antibiotics in the livestock sector. Here in the US, close to 80% of the antibiotics produced go towards industrial livestock production. The Center for Disease Control estimates that a minimum of 23,000 deaths occur annually due to antibiotic resistance. So what does this mean for China? China produced 210 million kilograms of antibiotics in 2008. Half of those went to livestock production. If we do a comparison, the US, with its massive crisis in antibiotic resistance, produces 13.2 million kilograms of antibiotics. So if it's a crisis in the US, what does it mean for China? And what does it mean for global health? You can read about all of this and more in our 4 reports that we just launched yesterday. And join us for our next webinar next Tuesday. Now I hand it back to Mindi to further address the impacts of the meat revolution. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to run through some of what I think are the biggest, most important implications of the pork miracle and some perhaps of this meat revolution more broadly. So first, the kinds of meat have changed in the context of industrialization and in the reform era. Where fresh cuts used to predominate and in fact have been the preferred form of meat, processed and packaged meats are now the fastest growing market segments, reflecting the support for agricultural processors, otherwise known as the dragon heads. And along with industrial meat, a number of food safety issues have emerged. Shefali just mentioned antibiotic resistance for one instance. I don't want to say too much about this now since it's the topic of the next webinar, but I do want to stress that food safety is among the top public concerns in China today. This is a cartoon from the opinion page of the Shanghai Daily, and there are numerous other examples of this in very mainstream media. Another implication of the way meat markets are organized is dietary inequalities. So meat consumption is rising across the population, but urban consumers eat almost twice as much meat as consumers in rural areas. And I need to mention here that consumption figures from the National Bureau of Statistics in China, they don't include meals eaten outside of the home. It's just counting meat and meals that are eaten at home. And so if we include meals eaten out, we would expect that urban meat consumption figures are probably underestimated by as much as 50%. I would say then that these figures describe a relationship, but they don't fully specify it. We also need to note here that the differences in meat consumption within urban and rural populations, as well as between urban and rural populations. And dietary inequalities in China are related to broader social inequalities. So China's Gini coefficient is somewhere around 0.61, which is considered highly unequal, and the urban to rural income ratio is 3.13 to 1. That means that people in urban areas are earning on average over 3 times as much as people in rural areas. Also, at the same time that China is home to over 1 million millionaires and has the second highest number of billionaires in the world, poverty remains. So the figures on the bottom of this slide show the millions of people in China that live under various measures of the poverty line, whether it's the UN estimate of $1.25 a day or the poverty line in China of $362 a year. And yet another expression of inequality is the emergence of diseases of affluence. There was a popular book that came out in 2006 called The China Study that was based on longitudinal nutritional research in China. And the authors detail a shift away from what they call diseases of poverty that arise from inadequate nutrition and poor sanitation to these so-called diseases of affluence that emerge from nutritional extravagance and, importantly, from massively increased meat consumption. These diseases include type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, obesity, and a range of diet-related cancers, all of which have become important public health issues in China today. A study in 2008 found that 1 in 4 Chinese adults and 20% of children were overweight. Another study found that in 2010, 100 million people in China were obese, with a 30 to 50% annual growth rate in obesity. And this isn't to say that increased meat consumption is the only cause of these issues, but it is an important piece of the puzzle. The meat boom also has serious environmental implications. One is that industrialization has led to declining genetic and species diversity. The shift to commercial feed and to commercial feeding of livestock has meant that smallholders are no longer growing certain plant species that have typically been used as livestock feed. So the photo here on the left shows a field of Niupi Cai, which is a feed crop that was grown in Sichuan, and I think there's no English translation for it. It's a particular crop in this place. And so as farmers give up pig raising, they're also giving up cultivation of this and other related crops. In a similar vein, China once had more than 6,000 varieties of soybean, and in fact Chinese soy is the basis for 90% of non-GMO soy varieties in the world. But the push for commercial feed and the effects of soy imports have severely eroded the crop's diversity, and today just a few varieties form the core of the soy industry. In terms of livestock, I mentioned that there were 100 varieties of indigenous pigs when the CAAS surveyed in 1960. Today, over 90% of China's pork is from Duroc, Landrace, and Yorkshire pigs, and these are the 3 breeds that dominate industrial production the world over. So indigenous pig breeds have all but been replaced in the livestock sector. Soil and water pollution are perhaps the most immediate threats, both of which are directly related to industrial livestock production. When the government released results of the country's first ever pollution census in 2009, the most startling finding was that agriculture and not industry was the most important source of water pollution. Of that, manure from industrial pork and poultry operations was the highest contributor. These excess nutrients in waterways from manure and from fertilizer runoff have ecological impacts on aquatic life and on water cycles. They also have devastating human costs. So when water becomes toxic and unusable, as in this photo from Sichuan province, the people who depend on it for drinking, for household, and for agricultural use are most affected. and these are already marginalized people for whom toxic water is just another layer of struggle. Now, further industrializing livestock production also increases the sector's greenhouse gas emissions, and this can be seen in terms of transporting feed, sometimes halfway across the globe, and also transporting meat products to market. It can be seen in terms of manure and gases from livestock production, and it can be seen in terms of land use change as more and more land is turned for feed production. So I've mentioned the scaling up of production and the exit of smallholders from pig raising, and many would frame this as progress and as an expected piece of development. But we also need to consider the challenges that arise for smallholder farmers. If they want to participate in pork markets, smallholder farmers are challenged to compete with firms, they're excluded by market standards, and they're missed by subsidy programs. And today, rural households are increasingly surviving because of migrant labor remittances, and farming as an occupation is becoming increasingly difficult. Another impact of the agricultural development model that supports agribusiness processors in particular is overcapacity. There's been so much investment in processing facilities that companies are now unable to fill their slaughter and processing lines. And these figures show the situation for the top 3 pork processors, and you can see that slaughter capacity far outpaces the actual slaughter in these firms. And finally, for impacts, there are questions about the continued consumer demand for pork and perhaps for meat in general. So the Rabobank reports a slowdown in the annual consumption growth of meat to 2%, down from a high of over 8%, and reports that pork share is declining from 80% of the share of total meat consumption to 65% in 2011. And recently, when I've been talking about these issues, colleagues and students and friends from China tell me that meat consumption in the middle and upper classes is decreasing. And they mention people becoming wary of the health impacts of meat-centric diets, and some who are curtailing meat consumption for ethical and for environmental reasons. So this, I think, is an emergent phenomenon and one that certainly warrants more research. Let me close here with 2 questions related to the questions Shefali posed. First, given the resource intensity of industrial pork production and its implications, how long can or will the pork miracle continue? And second, is there a point at which we'll reach peak meat, similar to the way we talk about peak oil and peak soil? And a related question, how will we know if and when we get there? And finally, I'll just leave you with an image of the report that much of this conversation is based on.
All right, well, thanks very much, Mindi and Shefali. That was great. It's a lot of information put in front of us. Please feel free to ask questions, as I pointed out in the sort of bar on the right side of your screen. You have a little section called questions. Just click on that, type them in, and we'll get to as many as we can here. One thing I wanted to point out was that this webinar will be posted on our website. It's being recorded, and so you will all get a link to the webinar afterwards. So if you want to share that at any point in the future, you can, or revisit it and see the slides again. So the first question we have is, I think for probably both Mindi and Shefali, is there any sign of China looking at this massive growth in meat production and questioning it, looking at some of these effects that Mindi just pointed out, and saying, wait a minute, maybe we should go this far? Are some of these issues being talked about there?
I can comment first on that. There certainly, it's no secret, particularly the water pollution issues. That's certainly no secret. That was the pollution census that came out of the central government and was made very public. So I think there's increasing recognition of the environmental implications of industrial meat production. And there's increasing attention to it with new regulations for industrial livestock production, new ideas for converting manure into biogas, new measures. I mean, the question will be, how long will it take for them to be implemented? How will they be implemented? And can we really regulate an industrial system in a way that alleviates the environmental stressors? And I don't think in the United States, for instance, where we're considered to have a more advanced, more regulated industrial system, we still have these environmental problems associated with it. So I think there is effort and attention, but there's still questions that remain about effectiveness.
Anything you want to add?
You know, it was interesting when we visited China in May last year as part of this research process, and we spoke to different policymakers, and it's true. So if you ask, you know, somebody in another ministry that's not agriculture, I think you'll get a different opinion. If you ask the Ministry of Agriculture, I think with all the investment that's gone into the meat sector, it seems very difficult to change that. But one senior official that we spoke to actually really did criticize the impacts of all of the meat production, saying that, you know, China does not have the land mass that the U.S. has, and so we're just not cut out for this kind of an industrial model that produces so much waste, that requires so much feed, and so perhaps we're better off just importing meat, so that the externalities of this is also, you know, is diffused and displaced. On the other hand, you had people saying, well, if we decided to depend on the world market for meat, we wouldn't even find enough meat on the, you know, in the supply in the world market. So I think that this is a really challenging question for the government, and I'm not sure that there's a unanimous opinion on this. But the fact that last week they did decide to forego grain self-sufficiency, which was being discussed even when we were there, I think is a clear signal that at least for the time being, they've decided that the meat production is an important element and that we really do need to liberalize the grains in order to support this project. The other interesting thing, I think, is the emergence of community-supported agriculture and the rise of an organic market in Beijing, for instance. We got a chance to visit the market and actually visit the farms where communities, and like Mindi points out, some of the wealthier consumers who are saying, you know what, we're really tired of this food safety issue, and we would like to see where the food is grown, and we'd like to support organic farming. So you've started to see the emergence of that as well, and I think as more and more of these kinds of projects bloom, there's going to be more of an effort to get the government to pay attention and to incentivize that kind of production. So I think that this is a space that's still open and in a period of transition.
Okay, great. I'm going to try to move us along because we got a number of very good questions coming in. One says the point Mindi just made about potentially declining meat consumption among upper income Chinese is very interesting. How do you think information about the downsides of U.S. style meat consumption and production is getting out to people in China? Are they aware of some of the concerns here?
Are they
you guys just
aware
need to jump in.
In the United States, is that what you mean? Or just
are people in China and government officials aware of some of the problems of industrial meat production, both production and consumption here in the United States?
I mean, I would say that what's important to signal in thinking about declining meat consumption that, you know, people are starting to talk about, and the emergence of CSAs and organic markets, is this is a really small segment, I would say. So there's going to be a small amount of the population who's eating less meat and going to organic markets and going to CSAs, but it's quite small. I would say people who most understand the impacts of industrial production are probably the people living next to those polluted bodies of water, for instance, which is a very different group of people, of consumers, how we call them. Most of them are farmers. people who actually live with the impacts of industrial production on a daily basis in a way that affects their lives. And those are not the people who are eating a lot of meat to begin with. So I just want to signal that kind of these different issues in the location of consumers, both in terms of their geographic location if they're in cities or in rural areas, and also then their relation in terms of income, in terms of class, makes a huge difference in how these consumption and these market issues play out. And Shefali, you probably have something to add to that, maybe.
No, I mean, I don't think I have. Yeah, no, that's okay. I didn't get that. I didn't get that kind of feedback from folks that they were really paying attention to the consumption habits in the U.S. And I think, yeah, and I think some of the things that you pointed out in the presentation about what is modernization and westernization, I think is still pretty profound overall in the urban areas where this is seen as something that, you know, means affluence, as you put it.
Right.
So another question about the emergence of poultry, and are we going to see that continue to grow and replace pork at some level as the sort of dominant meat in China, or is there also movement related to fish or seafood or even vegetarian diets?
I can jump in here. At least with the research that we did, it seemed like pork was always going to be, I mean, at least for the foreseeable future, and Mindi, maybe you have a different thought on this, for the next 10, 20 years, pork was still going to be the big segment, but poultry, but as Mindi pointed out, the growth rate is slowing down, and the growth rate for poultry is going up, and so I think more people will be consuming poultry over time. And aquaculture is a whole other thing that we just couldn't handle. I mean, just the 4 areas that we looked at was enormous, but the little bit that we paid attention to, yes, aquaculture is booming in China, and that's an area that, you know, needs further scrutiny to see how much of it would be displaced towards aquaculture.
I'll just say too, I think pork will probably remain the dominant meat category, like Shefali said, for quite a while. But I've talked to scientists, different research scientists, who are talking now about shifting to poultry as a more efficient form of meat that addresses some of these issues of associated with feed and with land use, and it may be promoted as sort of a more efficient, a more benign form of meat production, which I think, you know, we need to raise issues with that idea as well.
Okay. Another question. Pigs have traditionally been raised on food waste in many societies. Are pigs raised at the household level fed food waste? In industrial pig farming, is there any use of food waste?
Do you know, I don't know. My sense is that most industrial operations are using pretty much primarily commercial feed, the same kind of commercial feed we use in the States. I did interview some people who were working on different kinds of feed, someone who's working on something called biofeed that was using scraps, agricultural scraps, adding some kind of bacteria to create a kind of feed that was nutrient rich but was not based on soy or corn imports. So I think there's some research in these directions, but in general it's typically just your basic commercial feed in the industrial operations.
Okay. I have a question about credit in the growth, the importance or significance of having access to credit in the growth of, I think they're talking about dragonhead enterprises. Can you just explain a little bit about the interface between the government and private industry and how credit is available to support these kind of industry?
Sure. I think first, dragonheads aren't just private. There's still quite a few that are state-owned. It isn't just full kind of privatization of agribusiness. And credit for Dragon Head, the label, to get the Dragon Head recognition, one of the benefits of that is getting favorable loans. So maybe the payback, the interest is quite low, or the time to pay back is quite long. I don't know particularities. I'm not sure what the question is getting at. I just know that these favorable loans is one of the ways, one of the benefits of being a Dragon Head, and one that firms will say, you know, this is one of the major reasons we want Dragon Head designation.
Are antibiotics being manufactured in China, or are they being imported from other countries as they enter the feed stream there?
Shefali?
I think when we looked at, when we were looking at the dairy report, it seemed like the additives business is also really booming in China. So a lot of the vaccines, a lot of the antibiotics, a lot of the inputs that are going into feed to fortify feed is also being produced in China. And that was an interesting finding for us. So my guess, without having looked into detail, is that a lot of it is produced in China itself.
Okay. Cargill has recently been developing poultry broilers in China. What is the regulatory climate for foreign investment in domestic meat production and processing? So for a company like Cargill, are they treated the same as others in China? Is it a difficult regulatory environment to navigate?
I don't know if you want to take that on first, Mindi.
Yeah, it's a big question. Let me just give one example, I guess, of where it can be more difficult. From people at foreign agribusiness firms that I've spoken to, one of the most difficult parts of getting established in China is getting the land use rights to set up operations. And sometimes, not in all cases, but it could be easier for a domestic firm to get those rights through village governments. One firm I talked to, it took 3 years or so to get the rights to set up a poultry operation in a particular space. So I think it's a big question with a lot of different pieces, and I'll just comment on that one about land use. And Shefali, you can add.
Yeah, I mean, in the research that we looked at, you know, the government has these guidelines about what is restricted, what is allowed, and what is not allowed. And it didn't seem like officially there was a lot of restrictions, particularly on processing. Less so on production than processing. So I imagine that there's multiple layers. So there's, you know, looking at FDI and what is officially allowed and not allowed, and then really looking at, I think China keeps a close watch on the control of the market. And I think a big example of that is looking at soy, when the transnational corporations had really taken 70 to 80% of the soy crushing business. And then the government actually came back and said, all right, well, we need to revisit this policy. I think at the moment, the government is really bent on consolidating the meat sector, so both dairy, poultry, and pork. And I think part of that is attracting investment that is going to make these production processes more industrialized, and I think that's why, in terms of the rules, there are not that many formal restrictions in terms of, in particular, processing. The one thing that they did ban in terms of poultry was any transgenic kind of production. So that was something that was explicitly mentioned as a no-go area.
This is a question for Mindi. Can you clarify what you said about growing poverty in China despite the number of emerging billionaires and millionaires? The reason they're asking this question is because diseases of affluence are usually directly related to poverty. Cheaper food is typically less nutritious.
Yeah.
Can you just maybe?
Yeah, sure. One is, I think I didn't say poverty growing necessarily, just that it's persistent. So while you have this kind of explosion of 1 million millionaires, you also have poverty continuing. The other thing, the diseases of affluence, this is an interesting situation because we have in the United States, for instance, where our least healthy food is also, how do I want to say this? So here's an example. McDonald's in the United States is cheap food. In China, it might be a place that you take a date. It's not the cheapest food. So it isn't the same relationship necessarily between this kind of cheap food and the diseases of affluence. I'm not sure if that's clear, but the relationship gets a bit inverted.
Okay. There's a question about whether you know anything about whether the Chinese government has incorporated a meat-free day amongst its 7 green steps that they recommend citizens to take. Is this, you guys know anything about this?
I don't know. So if someone, it sounds like the person asking the question does, so maybe they could send us some information.
Yeah, I haven't heard about this.
Okay, great. We're kind of winding down here, so please send any last-minute questions. I got another one here about the Smithfield Shuanghui purchase, and is there a sense that China will shift a little bit and start to actually import pork itself and move away from its seemingly aversion to frozen pork, or why did that purchase happen? Was that about the system that Smithfield has, or actually moving to importing pork?
I think that deal was about a number of issues, not least of which is buying the company in order to list it on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange to get a high return on shares. I don't know, if you look at the evidence of all the investment into slaughter and processing in China and the current and continuing overcapacity of slaughter and processing, it would be surprising to me that at the same time there was a push for a lot of pork imports. It just doesn't seem like you'd invest in all this infrastructure just to import. That said, there could be a case, Shefali and I were talking about this the other day, of importing carcasses, frozen carcasses or half carcasses, and finishing the processing there in China. But I wouldn't look for imports of already processed and prepared frozen meats.
And I would also add, I mean, you know, Shuanghui just changed its name in January to be called the WH Group. And I think part of that is to really get this more international image that subsumes Smithfield into its new name and its new brand, and so that it's not seen explicitly as Chinese. And I think, you know, it's a mega company, a global company now with this combination, and I think it'll be interesting to see the role that it plays in other parts of the world. So I'm also, yeah, we were talking about this the other day, and we wondered whether more processing would take place in China. But I think I'm not sure the imports are going to change so drastically at this moment in time.
Yeah,
okay, well, we'll get to one last question here before we end. We've got about a minute left. But there's a question about labor conditions in some of the processing plants, and this is a big challenge here in the U.S. and other parts of the world. In your research, did you come up with much about the work environment for people working in processing plants in any of the meat sectors?
Oh, that's a really good question, and you know, it is hard to get access to any of these kinds of operations in China. But we did cover just that. I don't know if you all are familiar with the fire in the poultry plant that took place last year in the last half of 2013. And it was because many of the doors were locked, so the workers were actually trapped inside, and so many of them died not just from the fire, but also from just the ammonia fumes that were present. And I think that was the first glimpse that's one of the glimpses that you get when stories like this break out. And this speaks to the slides, that I was talking about in terms of the downward pressure that these firms are putting on the supply chain, and this need to produce more faster, and the intense competition, the intense price competition, and producing cheap meat, I think has a lot of impacts. But to be able to really assess what is exactly going on is very difficult, I think, to be able to see in China at the moment.
Any last words, Mindi?
I don't have anything to add to that last question.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. And again, it will be posted on our website, and we'll send out an email giving you a link to the posting of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.